12 people who opened Tutankhamun's tomb passed away within 7 years. Science has an explanation, but it doesn't cover everything. November 26, 1922, Howard Carter pressed a candle through a small hole in a sealed wall and peered into the darkness. Lord Carnarvon, the man who funded the excavation, leaned in close and whispered very quietly, "Can you see anything?" Carter's answer became one of the most famous sentences in the history of archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. What they saw that day had not been seen by human eyes for over 3,200 years, not even once, not even briefly. A burial chamber packed with gold, obsidian, lapis lazuli, and the undisturbed sarcophagus of a boy king. But what came next, in the weeks, months, and years that followed, would become a story science cannot fully close. Within 7 years of that moment, 12 people directly connected to the opening of the tomb would be dead. Some died quickly. Some died in ways that seemed almost theatrical, almost designed in their precise timing. Lord Carnarvon himself, the man who funded the entire excavation, would be dead within 5 short months. The papers exploded across every continent. The world settled on exactly one word to explain it: curse. And here is what makes this story genuinely worth examining more than a full century after it happened. Science stepped in, looked carefully at the evidence, and found real, documented explanations for some deaths. But not all of them, not even close to accounting for every name on that list in any satisfying way. Today we walk through the real data, the names, the dates, the causes, the forensic science, with precision. And then we look at exactly what the science still cannot account for, no matter how carefully it tries. Because this is not a clean, simple story about superstition sitting on one side and cold reason on the other. This is a story about what happens when the facts themselves refuse to fit neatly inside either of those boxes. To understand what happened to these people, you first need to understand what they actually walked into. Not just who they were professionally, you need to understand what they physically stepped inside and breathed. The Valley of the Kings, November 1922. A dry limestone canyon on the west bank of the Nile, 500 kilometers south of Cairo, under a sun that turns the desert air into something heavy, ancient, and almost solid enough to bite into. Carter's team had been digging in this valley for 5 full seasons, hundreds of meters of trenches, 0 results. Lord Carnarvon had nearly withdrawn all the money. Carter begged for just one more season, just one final attempt. On the 4th day of that final season, a worker's foot broke through into something hollow and dark beneath the sand. They had found the steps, 16 stone steps going straight down into blackness that had not seen light in millennia. Sealed at the bottom, a plastered doorway bearing the royal necropolis seal, intact and completely undisturbed. For 3,245 years, not one single person had touched it, breathed near it, or laid eyes on what was sealed behind it. Now, who exactly was standing at the top of those steps on the day the seal was finally broken open? Howard Carter himself, British, obsessive, a meticulous archaeologist who had devoted 31 full years to this valley. Lord George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, the financial patron, already in fragile health from damaged lungs. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's composed and precise daughter, one of the very first people into the inner chamber. Arthur Mace, assistant archaeologist, responsible for physically documenting every object removed from the antechamber. Hugh Evelyn White, a scholar of Egyptian sites who visited the tomb in the weeks immediately following its opening. George Benedict, a senior French Egyptologist who traveled specifically to the site in order to inspect the discovery. Aaron Ember, an American Egyptologist at Johns Hopkins, a language specialist connected to the find through his work. Archibald Reed, the radiologist brought in to X-ray the royal mummy, the man who looked through 3,200 years of linen. Richard Bethel, Howard Carter's personal secretary, the man who managed all of his papers and his correspondence. Lord Westbury, Richard Bethel's elderly father, a man who never once set foot in Egypt his entire long life. And Ali Fahmy Bey, an Egyptian nobleman whose place on this list came not from the air he breathed, but from the press. These are the 12 names most consistently cited across a century of reporting on the curse of the pharaohs. Remember every single one of them, because over the next 7 years, this list would begin to empty, one name at a time. Lord Carnarvon was the first name to leave the list, April 5th, 1923, 4 months and 10 days after the opening. Think about that compressed timeline. The discovery was announced to the entire world on November 29th, 1922. By the following spring, the man who paid for every shovel, every season, every worker, was already dead. The official cause sounds almost embarrassingly mundane. An infected mosquito bite on his cheek, nicked while shaving. The infection spread methodically, erysipelas first, then pneumonia settled into his already scarred lung tissue. Then his kidneys failed, then his liver. He lasted exactly 2 weeks from the appearance of the first fever. Now picture Cairo at the precise moment Lord Carnarvon stopped breathing in his room at the Continental Savoy. According to contemporary reports from multiple sources, every single light in the city went out simultaneously. Without warning, without a technical explanation that anyone could identify clearly enough to put in writing afterward. The Cairo Power Authority later attributed the blackout to an electrical fault, but could not say which fault or why. And at Highclere Castle in England, 3,500 kilometers away, his dog Susie began howling loudly at some point that same night. Then the dog fell silent. Then the dog was found dead the following morning. Cause undetermined and never explained. Are these specific details verified beyond any reasonable doubt? They are not, and almost certainly cannot be. Are they reported by multiple independent contemporary sources from the weeks of April 1923? They very clearly are. You can decide what to do with that particular gap between those two statements entirely on your own. Arthur Mace died in 1928, 5 years after being one of the first people to physically enter the burial chamber. He had been the one kneeling on the antechamber floor, lifting objects that no hand had touched since Horemheb reigned. His hands sorted through gilded furniture and alabaster jars, and wooden figures with eyes of black obsidian staring up. His physicians recorded his cause of death as arsenic poisoning, though his health had been declining since before 1922. Some historians argue his deterioration clearly predated the tomb work. Others find the specific cause too convenient. Hugh Evelyn White died in 1924, just 2 years after the opening, at the age of only 40 years old. He reportedly took his own life and left behind a note alleged by some sources to have been written in his own blood. The note, if it genuinely existed, read, "I have succumbed to a curse which forces me to disappear from the world." Whether that note was real or a journalist's embellishment woven into the story has never been conclusively determined. His death at 40, however, is a matter of documented public record, and no one disputes it happened when it did. Georges Benedit, the French Egyptologist, died in 1926, 4 years after his visit to the excavation site. He collapsed and died shortly after returning from Egypt, aged 69, in what had been previously stable health. Aaron Ember died in 1926 as well, but not in Egypt, and not from anything science could connect to a sealed chamber. He died in Baltimore, Maryland, thousands of miles from any tomb, in a house fire that started in the night. He ran back into the burning house, not for his children, not for his wife. They had already made it outside. He ran back inside to save the manuscript sitting open on the desk in his study on the upper floor of the building. The manuscript was his translation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. He did not make it back out the door. Archibald Reed, the radiologist who x-rayed the pharaoh's wrapped face without ever unwrapping it, died in 1924. His cause was recorded by physicians simply as debilitating illness, a description with nothing specific attached. Richard Bethel, Howard Carter's personal secretary, was found dead in his bed on the morning of November 15, 1929. He was 49 years old, with no prior illness documented, no warning symptoms reported, and no explanation offered. Within 3 months of Bethel's death, his elderly father, Lord Westbury, fell from the 7th-floor window of his home. A note found nearby reportedly referenced both his son's recent death and the sealed tomb in the Valley of Kings. Lord Westbury had never traveled to Egypt. He had never entered any tomb. He had never touched a single object. The deaths were accumulating now, one by one at first, then arriving in closer clusters as the years went on. The press had built its narrative, the public had found its terror, and one particular man kept quietly going to work. Howard Carter, who entered first, breathed the air first, catalogued every room for a decade, lived until 1939, 16 uninterrupted years after the opening, writing and working and publishing with complete and documented focus. He died at 64, lymphoma, a disease with no documented connection to anything inside any sealed ancient chamber. If a curse was operating here, it was extraordinarily patient with the one person it had every reason to strike. And ruthless enough, somehow, to reach a man in London who had never once set foot on Egyptian soil in his life. Decades after the last of these deaths, a different kind of investigator began asking a completely different question. Not, was there a curse that reached across decades and continents and struck the guilty and the innocent equally? But simply this: what was actually living and waiting inside that perfectly sealed chamber for 3,000 years? Close your eyes for a moment and think carefully about what a sealed ancient tomb physically and chemically is. Stone walls cut into limestone, no light at all, no airflow, no exchange with the outside world for 3 millennia. Inside, organic material, linen wrappings soaked in ritual oils that had slowly broken down over 3 centuries. Wooden furniture sealed with animal fat varnish, food offerings left for the king's journey, crystallized over time. And in the dark, in the stillness, in the complete and undisturbed anaerobic silence of 3,000 years, organisms, microscopic, ancient, patient beyond any measure, still biologically active after 3,000 years, waiting. Dr. Ezzedine Taha of Cairo University found in the 1960s that Egyptologists working with mummies showed elevated illness. The specific organism he identified as the primary culprit: Aspergillus niger, an ancient mold preserved for millennia. Preserved in low oxygen conditions, still fully capable of colonizing human lung tissue once given any access to air. This is not mythology wearing scientific language. This is peer-reviewed microbiology with documented clinical findings. Breathe it in with a healthy immune system, and your body neutralizes it efficiently. You may not even feel unwell. But breathe it into lungs already scarred and compromised, operating at reduced capacity since a 1901 car accident, and the infection finds tissue that cannot mount the resistance needed to stop it from spreading through the airways. Lord Carnarvon had moved to Egypt on medical advice specifically because dry desert air was kinder on his scarred lungs. Picture that particular fact very carefully and hold it still for a moment before you move past it to anything else. A man with the most damaged lungs in the entire excavation team, crouching in a chamber sealed for 3,245 years, breathing that first exhalation of ancient preserved air, then going home and nicking a small wound open on his face. That sequence of events is not supernatural. That sequence of events is cause followed directly and logically by effect. But Aspergillus niger was far from the only organism documented to have been waiting patiently inside that darkness. Histoplasma capsulatum thrives in organic-rich environments and causes fatal illness in anyone immunocompromised. Cryptococcus neoformans, another ancient pathogen, was later found preserved in multiple Egyptian burial sites. On top of the biological hazards, there are chemical ones: hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and formaldehyde pooled inside. Breathe the first air from a 3,000-year-old sealed door, and you inhale a cocktail no safety standard covers. A 2003 study in the British Medical Journal examined the survival records of 44 Westerners present during the opening. The researchers found no statistically significant difference between those who entered and those who stayed outside. No curse. That was the conclusion, stated plainly and published in a peer-reviewed journal for anyone to read. But the study had real limitations: small sample size, incomplete records, no control for pre-existing conditions. Carnarvon's damaged lungs, for instance, were a variable no retrospective population study could adequately isolate. So science built a solid, credible, empirically grounded explanation for some of the deaths, and only some. Let us be precise about this, as precise as the scientists who studied it were trying to be, and then a little more so. The biological explanation applies to people physically inside the chamber, breathing air, handling organic objects. That group is real. The biological risk facing that group is real. The science behind that explanation is real. But the list also includes Ember, Baltimore, Maryland, United States of America, house fire, Book of the Dead. The list also includes Lord Westbury, London, England, 7th floor window, a note referencing a tomb he never saw. Neither of them was ever inside that sealed chamber at any point before or after its opening in November 1922. Neither of them breathed the ancient preserved air or handled a single linen-wrapped object at any point in their lives. Neither of them was exposed to Aspergillus Niger, Histoplasma capsulatum, or any gas from 3,200 years of darkness. Their only link to Tutankhamun ran through other people entirely, one through a colleague, one through a son. And yet, their names appear on every single published version of the curse list across a full century of press coverage. If we are being genuinely rigorous, actually rigorous, not just performing it, we strip those names off the list. We say clearly, these are coincidences attached to the narrative by journalistic proximity, not by physical evidence. And when we do exactly that, something interesting and uncomfortable happens simultaneously at the exact same moment. The curse narrative shrinks considerably, becomes smaller and far less cinematically terrifying when examined clearly. But it does not disappear. It refuses to vanish, no matter how carefully you apply the scientific logic to it. What remains is a core of people physically present, who died in medically unusual ways at an unusually compressed rate. And Howard Carter, who sits at the center of every biological risk calculation by every metric that exists, had more hours of direct exposure to the sealed air than any other individual on the entire excavation team. He cataloged that tomb room by room for a full decade, breathed that air more than any other human being alive. Howard Carter lived until March 1939 and is not on any version of any curse list. He died of lymphoma, that's all. Lady Evelyn Herbert entered the inner chamber before most of the official scientific team arrived at the site. She reported no illness connected to the tomb in any documented source. She lived to the age of 78 years old. Meanwhile, the radiologist who x-rayed the mummy at careful distance died of a vague, entirely unspecified illness. The pattern, if it is genuinely a pattern, does not follow the rules of exposure the biological explanation requires. Now consider the curse inscription, the specific hieroglyphic text that launched 100 newspaper front pages. Every newspaper in the world in 1923 quoted the same dramatic warning, supposedly carved at the tomb's sealed entrance. Death will come on swift wings to whoever disturbs the peace of the king. That was the text. That was everywhere. But Howard Carter's meticulous excavation records documented every surface of every wall in every single room. Those records show no such inscription at the entrance. None at all. The warning that launched the legend did not exist. What was found, deeper inside, on a gilded shrine in the treasury, was a text invoking Isis and Nephthys. a religious declaration calling divine protection onto the pharaoh's remains, a blessing, not a threat to the living. The curse inscription in every 1923 newspaper worldwide was almost certainly invented by someone who needed a story. The most likely author? Journalist Arthur Weigel, who reportedly said while watching Carnarvon joke at the entrance, "If he goes down in that spirit, I give him 6 weeks to live." 5 months later, Carnarvon was dead. Weigel followed. Here is the genuinely strange part, stranger, arguably, than any single death on the entire list put together. The ancient Egyptians absolutely, verifiably used documented curse texts to protect royal burial chambers for centuries. These texts exist in tombs throughout the Valley of the Kings. They are explicit. They are specific in their threats. They describe being devoured by sacred animals, consumed by divine fire, erased from the book of the living forever. They used these curses with conviction. They inscribed them into stone specifically so they would endure for millennia. They simply, for reasons no archaeologist has satisfactorily explained, did not put one here, not at the entrance. Or they put one here, and Carter's decade-long comprehensive documentation somehow failed to record it anywhere at all. Which leaves a question sitting at the exact center of this story, like a room that nobody has excavated or opened yet. Why did this specific tomb, the most intact, most celebrated, most documented burial ever found, produce this list? Science can give a partial answer. A real, documented, peer-reviewed answer honestly arrived at, for some of the names. For the rest of the list, the answer sits in the dark, 3,000 years old, waiting with considerable patience. Here is the full inventory of what we can state with absolute documented certainty about this story and nothing more. A 19-year-old boy was placed in a chamber cut from Valley of the Kings limestone with extraordinary attention. Gold shrines nested inside each other like enormous gilded boxes, each sealed tightly around the next with black resin. Alabaster canopic jars holding his preserved organs, arranged beside a solid gold death mask fitted to his face. Linen wrappings soaked in sacred oil, wound carefully over 70 days of meticulous and documented ritual preparation. His people believed the soul survived death completely, that it traveled onward from the body and required protection. And they were not casual about it. They acted on that belief with the full technical and artistic resources available. They sealed the room with stone and plaster. They covered the entrance with rubble to look like undisturbed ground. They inscribed protective texts on every surface, on the walls, the shrines, wound carefully into the linen wrappings. And then they walked away and left it in the darkness and the silence of sealed limestone for 32 full centuries. For 3,245 years, every element of that protection held exactly as it was designed and intended and constructed to hold. When Carter's candle pierced the wall and sealed air met outside air for the first time since the Bronze Age ended, something crossed that threshold from one side to the other. That much is documented, observable, and not disputed. Maybe only ancient chemistry, spores and pathogens and trapped gases finally reacting with oxygen after long millennia. Maybe that is the whole answer. Maybe every death can eventually be filed under that heading and the case fully closed. But consider what else was present in that room, alongside all the chemistry for 3,000 years of total darkness. 3,000 years of concentrated intention, inscribed, documented, pressed into stone and gold and sacred linen. The formally recorded belief of an entire civilization that this specific space was protected by powers it had named. Does belief leave a measurable residue? Does concentrated intention become something a petri dish can actually detect? Science answers that question with a firm, data-supported negative, and it explains most of those deaths well enough. Lord Carnarvon. Scarred lungs, ancient mold, a small nick that should have healed and for some reason simply did not. Arthur Mace. Deteriorating health, arsenic in his system, years of exposure to the chamber contents, mostly explained. Hugh Evelyn White. 40 years old, a note written in blood, a declaration of submission to something he could not name. Aaron Ember, Baltimore, a house fire, the Book of the Dead burning as he ran back inside and did not return alive. 12 people, 7 years, and one man at the center of every exposure calculation who simply, quietly, lived on. Howard Carter entered first, worked longest, breathed deepest, and wrote 10 volumes about it before dying of lymphoma. If the curse was real and operating in the world, it passed over its most obvious and logical proximate target entirely. If the curse was built from journalism and coincidence, it found several of the others with remarkable cold precision. Carter was asked near the end of his life, more than once, whether he believed in the curse attached to his discovery. He dismissed it every single time, with what every biographer describes consistently as his characteristic impatience. But Carter spent 16 years in daily contact with a civilization that built its entire world on one single idea: that the things you cannot see, measure, or place in a petri dish are exactly as real as the things you absolutely can. He read their words for 16 years. He translated their prayers. He held objects made to outlast every empire alive. He understood, better than almost anyone alive in that century, precisely what it was they had been trying to say. Maybe the real question is not whether a curse was present in that room and followed people home from the valley. Maybe the real question is whether there is any difference at all between a curse working through supernatural force and a pattern working through chemistry and coincidence and a compression of deaths too consistent to dismiss entirely. The Valley of the Kings still sits in its canyon under the same sun that watched Carter's candle go through that wall. Dozens of royal tombs still sealed. Dozens of rooms not yet opened. Air pockets undisturbed since the Age of Iron began. Science will keep studying what comes out of those rooms and keep finding real, peer-reviewed biological explanations. And some of what emerges from those rooms will still not fit cleanly inside what any scientific framework can measure. 12 people, 7 years, one room sealed for 32 centuries. A boy dead 3,200 years, still generating debate. The argument about what that tomb did to the people who opened it has not paused for one single day since November 1922. That unbroken century-long argument may itself be the most enduring thing the curse has actually managed to produce. If this story changed how you think about ancient Egypt and what it was actually trying to do, subscribe right now. Because there are rooms beneath that canyon no one has opened yet, and some are still waiting for the right question.